The intensity of the blast had left Layla traumatized. The car they had been about to get into had been struck by something, and the front section had been separated from the back section. The back seats had remained attached, and the severed car's body had spun into the air and flipped over several times before crashing into the ground. Layla felt as if her body had been ripped in half, and her limbs ached. She recalled seeing smoke and dust, and then she lost consciousness. Layla heard Sean's voice in the distance. He called her over and over again until she slowly regained consciousness. "Layla, wake up! Are you okay?" They rummaged around blindly to find something sharp enough to cut the thick rope bound around their hands before being able to remove the duct tape that kept the blindfolds over their eyes in place. They squinted as their eyes grew accustomed to the bright sunlight, and they stared at the terrible scene before them. The car was mangled, and the front section was missing. An awful acrid smell stung their noses as burning debris lay scattered across the road. Their kidnapper was near them, but his body was slumped over. There was a huge hole in his chest, and there was a fragment of the car in his abdomen. He was covered in dark red blood, and his eyes were still open. There was no doubt that he was dead, even though he seemed to be staring into the distance with glassy eyes. Layla cried out in fright, but her voice was hoarse and her throat burned. She thought that the heat from the explosion must have dried out her mucous membranes. She looked at Sean and gasped. He was in a terrible condition. He had dislocated one of his arms, and he spat out a large mouthful of blood as he spoke. The contrast of his bright red blood against his white t-shirt was horrifying. Layla struggled to untie the rope around her feet and pushed herself up slowly, going onto her knees before carefully standing upright. Sean also pushed himself up and used his good hand to support her. He looked bewildered and frightened, and his handsome face contorted as he took in the scene around him. "Where are we?" They had been drugged with a strong sedative the moment they had been kidnapped. They didn't know how long they had been asleep or how long they had traveled, but it had seemed like a long time. Someone in the car said they would be taken to Oliver and Reggie, and he had also mentioned Peru and Chile. They looked at one another in a state of absolute shock. Layla took a deep breath. "Do you think we're in the war zone? At the border between Peru and Chile?" It seemed almost absurd that their kidnappers had died in a war zone, but there was no other explanation. The sound of planes echoed in the distance, accompanied by the booms of bomb blasts and the occasional rattle of gunshots. Although free, they were also in the vortex of a brutal war. They stood and stared at their surroundings, confused and afraid, not knowing what to do or where to go. They hadn't eaten in more than a day and had only had a few sips of water. They were hungry and thirsty. Shane had a few coins in his pockets, but they were Cuban pesos. Their phones had been confiscated, making it impossible for them to contact their families for help. They didn't know the time of day or what direction they were facing. Suddenly, 3 fighter jets streaked across the sky. The sonic boom rang in Layla's and Sean's ears, reminding them of the deafening sound of the blast earlier. Sean instinctively pulled Layla to the ground and covered her with his body until the jets had passed over the horizon. He sighed with relief once they were gone and helped Layla up again. His face was dirty with dried blood, black marks and dust. His hair was messy and looked gray. He didn't have time to care about anything other than trying to find a place to hide. "Layla, we have to find shelter somewhere. We're like sitting ducks out here." She nodded and frowned when she looked at his arm. "Your arm looks badly hurt. What should we do?" "Don't worry about that now. Let's find somewhere safe to hide, and then we'll figure out what to do next." They stumbled through the smoldering debris toward the ruins of a building. Meanwhile, amid an intense battle zone in a small rural town, Bruno cracked his knuckles and flung a sniper rifle bag over his shoulder before darting up a broken staircase to the spot he had just chosen. Bruno set up his sniper rifle. His camouflage uniform blended in perfectly with his surroundings, making him invisible. He squinted as he peered through the scope mounted above the rifle's muzzle and took aim. He had received news that the Riqueza group in Peru planned to send their people to Chile to snatch the reagent formula from the biomanufacturing facility. Bruno chuckled softly. Percor Industries was financing the war, and the Riqueza group only wanted to monopolize the profits the reagent formula would generate while contributing as little else as possible. Percor's main aim wasn't to deal with Chile. They wanted to take advantage of the chaos of war to destroy the Riqueza group and take over their vast properties. Bruno had already spotted his target in the building opposite him and locked a scope in position. His instructor, Mr. K, had praised him recently. He said that although it was easy to learn something, it was difficult to reach the top, and one needed talent to succeed. He had told Bruno that meeting someone with enough talent was rare. In the beginning, Mr. K had said Bruno had been handpicked because he was young and unafraid of death. The death of Bruno's mother and being detested by the Healy family had made him the ideal candidate for mercenary work. During his basic training, Bruno had discovered a knack for sniping. He had mastered the skill in less than a month, while it usually took skilled riflemen years to accomplish the same feat. When he had started training, Bruno had lacked physical strength because he had been recovering from being poisoned. It was only because of his age that he had been able to get into shape within the required time frame. He didn't worry about being killed on duty and was always selected for the most dangerous missions the mercenary group signed up for. He had also been promoted to duty commander of his team. He didn't care much for the bonus rewards he had started accumulating from executing successful missions. Bruno was empty inside, devoid of any emotions. He stared through the scope and felt as if he had become one with his weapon as he locked onto his target. 5 bodyguards from the Riqueza group had surrounded a man dressed in black as he opened a large steel safe. Bruno breathed out and pressed down on the trigger. A single bullet shot through the air, cut through the glass window, and hit the man in between the eyes. 3 bodyguards spun around, looking for the direction of the shot, while the other 2 rushed to help the man in black, but it was too late. His body lay motionless on the floor. Bruno packed his sniper gun away into a slim canvas bag. His dark eyes showed no expression, and he didn't even feel a sense of accomplishment from his actions. It had been rumored that the Riqueza group's infiltrator at the biomanufacturing base in Chile had already been killed. It was wishful thinking for them to expect they would be able to snatch the reagent out of Percor's hands. Bruno wondered how chaotic things were in the Riqueza group. He took his binoculars out of his pocket and looked at the building opposite him. Suddenly, he noticed movement in his peripheral vision. The bomb blast had razed a 3-story building to the ground, and only rubble and debris remained. 2 figures hid between the gaps of the cement slabs. He wouldn't have seen them if he hadn't been perched high above the building. He squinted and frowned as he peered through the binoculars. He could tell it was a man and a woman, and they were in bad shape. It was evident that they were ordinary citizens because they were huddled close together and looked afraid, hiding between the rubble and not daring to move. The woman looked familiar to him. Although he couldn't see her face clearly, something about her made him think of Layla. His heart skipped a beat, and he felt a sudden surge of emotions he thought he had suppressed. Bruno imagined that the woman hiding in the rubble was Layla. He tried to get a better view of her, but a large pile of debris blocked his sight. A man was crouched over her, as if to protect her, and she looked vulnerable. He suddenly felt sorry for her. He shook his head. It couldn't be Layla. She was in Havana, living the carefree life of a university student in her perfect and sheltered world. He knew she must have wondered what had become of him because of what had happened shortly after he had left Havana. But he thought that she would eventually forget about him and he would fade from her memory. He expected her to have more friends and was sure scores of boys from privileged backgrounds, untainted by the hardships of life, would chase after her. He imagined her meeting someone she liked and how she would smile sweetly at him, just like she had once smiled at him. Bruno took a deep breath and turned his gaze back toward the building where his target had been standing only moments earlier. The building was empty, and the target's lifeless body had been taken away. A pool of blood remained as evidence of what had happened. Bruno realized he must have been staring at the people hiding in the rubble for a long time. His two-way radio crackled, and he heard a subordinate's voice. "Deputy Commander, Percor is requesting you see them." "Okay, I'm on my way." He slid the binoculars back into his pocket and left. After a short meeting with Percor, Bruno joined his teammates for a few drinks. They chatted excitedly about their mission. They had successfully killed the men from the Riqueza group, and their next mission would be much easier. The Peruvian ground forces were weak and depended on their air force's strength. It had been tough to stabilize the situation on the ground, and Peru's air force had carried them to an unexpected victory. The last rays of sunlight disappeared over the horizon, and darkness crept over the dusty, war-torn landscape. Layla and Sean waited in their hiding spot until the street was deserted before clambering out. They were dehydrated and so hungry that they felt dizzy. Their eyes blurred from the dust in the air, and their throats burned. They had also both suffered from internal injuries and were in immense pain. They edged along the debris and occasionally saw pools of blood in the sand from where someone had been killed. The stench made Layla's stomach churn. Sean held her hand tightly, afraid, because they were injured and unarmed. They had no way of defending themselves and felt scared and vulnerable. They eventually came across a grocery store. It was a small store and could have easily been a family-run business. While they were hiding, Sean had tried to click his dislocated arm back in place, but he hadn't managed, and it hurt every time he moved. They crept up to the store doors and listened quietly for a while. After ensuring no movement or sound came from inside, Sean pushed the door open. Suddenly, Layla cried out in alarm. The body of a man with a bullet wound in his chest fell toward them, barely missing them as it landed on the ground with a thud. Layla and Sean stood dead still and waited, but the air around them was quiet, and there were no signs of life. Layla choked back her tears and followed Sean into the store. They each grabbed a bottle of water and took large sips to quench their thirst. Layla took long gulps of water and slowly began to feel slightly better. She cupped some water in her hands to wash the dirt and dust off her face and peered around the store, trying to think of what provisions they needed the most. Sean took a basket and walked along the aisle, grabbing food they could eat without cooking. They stuffed their loot into a shopping bag and were about to leave when they heard the roar of a car's engine coming down the street. They looked at each other with wide eyes and quickly scurried into a corner to hide. Layla held on to Sean, praying that the car would drive past them, but it slowed down and stopped outside the store. Then they heard the car door slam shut and boots crunching in the dirt as someone walked toward the store. Layla began to tremble, and her heart sank. She leaned against Sean, terrified of what might happen to them if they were discovered. Sean put his arm around her and tried his best to make them disappear in the shadows. They heard the door of the store squeak open and the heavy footsteps of a soldier enter. Layla peered past Sean and gazed at the ground. The linoleum tiles were covered in a thick layer of dust, and she saw a dirty pair of well-worn boots in the dim light. The soldier seemed to be alone. He was wearing black pants, and he was tall. Apart from that, Layla couldn't see anything else. Bruno had seen them hiding in the dark corner when he entered the store. He locked eyes on the two crouching figures and narrowed his eyes. The man shielding the woman was dirty and looked injured, with dried blood all over what had once been a white t-shirt. Bruno couldn't make out his facial features, but he looked young. The woman trembled as she cowered in the man's arms. She also looked dirty and looked frail. It was evident that they were the same unarmed civilians he had seen earlier that afternoon. And Bruno guessed that they had gone into the store because they were hungry and thirsty. It was obvious that they were scared out of their wits. Sean kept his head down, and Layla squeezed her eyes shut. Bruno pretended not to notice them. He gazed over them and walked toward the till. He reached over the counter and grabbed a pack of cigarettes from the shelf. He casually opened the packet, took out a cigarette, and put it between his lips before taking a lighter out of his pocket. He lit the cigarette, and red sparks flickered in the dim light as he exhaled a plume of smoke. He leaned against the counter and continued to smoke. Layla tried to hold her breath as the foul smell of cigarette smoke stung her nostrils. She felt as if she were suffocating. She gritted her teeth and forced back a cough. She held it in until her entire body ached and her throat itched. Every second felt like torture. Eventually, the red glow of the burning cigarette dimmed, and the soldier dropped the butt onto the ground. He pressed his boot over it and exhaled slowly. Then, a voice called from outside. "Deputy Commander, is everything okay?" Bruno gazed at the trembling figures and turned around to leave. As he walked toward the door, his boots crunched the dirt and debris on the floor. "Get ready to leave." Layla's skin prickled and her eyes went wide. Her body stiffened and she gasped. Sean pulled her closer and whispered, "What's wrong? Be quiet. He's still outside." Layla didn't have time to answer. She struggled out of his embrace and tiptoed to the window to peer outside. The soldier was tall, and in the car's headlights, his legs created a long shadow that stretched across the pavement. He was wearing a black camouflage uniform with the insignia of a gold python sewn onto his shoulder. He strode to the SUV and opened the door. He slid in, and the bright car lights shone into Layla's eyes, blurring her vision, and she couldn't see his face. The voice she had heard was too familiar. She was confused, because although the man had sounded just like Bruno, how he walked, and even the mere fact that he smoked, made her think that she had been mistaken. Sean reached over and pulled her back. He was still in a state of shock, and she was in a daze. They heard the sound of the car's engine fade into the distance, and the eerie stillness returned. Not wanting to stay there any longer, they hurried out, crept along the abandoned street, and scurried back to their hiding spot in the ruins. They ate quickly, drank more water, and started to doze off. Layla tried her best to stay awake, but she was exhausted. She leaned against Sean and dropped off to sleep. Sean also tried to keep his eyes open. He thought he would keep a lookout while Layla rested, but it didn't take long before he fell asleep as well. The faint rumble of gunfire and explosions echoed in the distance as the two figures huddled together for comfort. Peru wanted to use the war as an excuse to destroy the biomanufacturing lab in Chile. Although a direct strike was almost impossible, they could at least infiltrate it and try to take it out from the inside. Time was of the essence, and they had to act fast. Kyle sped across the night sky in his fighter jet when he heard a voice crackle over the radio. "Kilo Delta 132 has been hit." He scowled. "Return to base immediately. Kilo Delta 191, take over and fire at will." The jet engines roared, and the ground-to-air missiles streaked through the air. The battle was intense. Kyle and his squad had been fighting since dawn, and the enemy had held them back, showing no signs of retreat. The Chilean Air Force had begun to counterattack, and the Peruvian troops were fighting with everything they had. Both sides had reached their limit in what had become a brutal war. The radio crackled again. "Kilo Delta 132 has landed, but the pilot is injured. He needs urgent medical treatment." Kyle clicked his tongue angrily. "It's time to retreat. Begin evacuation procedures." There was a commotion on the ground, and several people shouted in a frenzy. "The medical team is attending to the wounded at the front lines. Have the reinforcements arrived? Officer Lee's in bad shape. We need help." "We're sending help. Officer Davis is on the ground. She'll be there soon." Kyle's eyes went wide, and his heart sank. Rebecca had arrived that afternoon. She had passed through the front lines and joined the medical personnel team at the base. A missile had hit a squad of infantrymen, and she had been called back to the front line to attend to the injured. She had just returned to the base as Lee was carried to the makeshift medical tent. She hurried over to him and spoke calmly. "Lee, keep still. I need to stop the bleeding." She quickly unzipped her medical kit and began to treat him. Missiles shot across the sky as Rebecca rummaged in her medical bag to find tweezers to remove the shrapnel from Lee's body. The earth-shattering noise of bombs exploding and of fighter jets were unnerving, and the world seemed chaotic as she tried to bandage Lee with nothing but her torchlight to see with. She had to work fast to stop the bleeding until she could get him into a medical tent with more equipment. Lee groaned with pain, and his face was pale. "Rebecca, don't go back to the front line again. The fighting's too intense. It has become very dangerous. Kyle's worried about you. You've got to stay here at the base." She paused momentarily, surprised he had said that to her, and then she quickly resumed putting gauze against his wounds. Her white latex gloves were covered in blood, and beads of sweat gathered on her forehead. "It's going to be okay, Lee." Lee grimaced and breathed heavily to control the pain as Rebecca led him to the medical tent. She handed him over to one of the medical staff and refilled her medical bag before running back outside to attend to the next group of injured soldiers who had just arrived. The troops had been taking a beating, and the sight of young soldiers with missing limbs, gaping wounds, and blood was difficult to take in. Rebecca thought about Kyle and gritted her teeth. She would give him a piece of her mind the moment he landed. Although he frustrated her, she also worried he might not return safely. A wave of anxiety washed over her each time she heard the enemy's ground-to-air missiles whistle through the air. Kyle's eyes were bloodshot from exhaustion. He watched in disdain as a fighter jet had been flying alongside him burst into flames. He didn't see if the pilots had ejected in time, and his heart sank. The thought of losing his teammates infuriated him, and he suddenly felt re-energized. He pulled his throttle up and rose into the sky, ready to loop back and release a hail of bullets at the enemy's troops on the ground. Kyle's reactions were fast. Each time an enemy plane appeared, he would aim and fire without missing a single shot. It didn't take long for him to become the primary target, and 2 enemy jets closed in from behind. Rebecca looked up and saw 3 jets in the air. She suddenly froze, as she instinctively knew that one of the jets was Kyle's, and he was being chased. The jets disappeared over the horizon as their missiles' bright flashes sparkled like stars. Rebecca found herself spellbound, unable to look away as she anxiously waited for the planes to fly overhead again. Her heart suddenly leaped into her throat when she saw 3 planes high in the sky, like small dots darting about. The first plane dove nose down, and the other 2 followed close behind. Just as it seemed like the first plane was about to crash into the earth below, it scooped up and rose back into the sky. One of the planes chasing behind was going too fast and burst into a ball of flames as it crashed into the ground. The third plane looped up just in time and roared into the night sky in pursuit of the first plane. Rebecca gasped anxiously as the 2 jets disappeared into the distance again. It felt like an eternity before she could see them again. The first plane repeated its maneuver, but this time it flew directly over a ground-to-air missile station just as a missile had been released. A giant fireball exploded in midair, and Rebecca held her breath. Her body was drenched in a cold sweat as she waited to see which plane had been hit. Then, she saw the first plane appear out of the plumes of smoke and sped into the dark sky. Shocked, Rebecca breathed a heavy sigh of relief. She wanted to shout with joy, and her heart swelled with pride. In a matter of minutes, Kyle had successfully destroyed 2 enemy aircraft. He had even made it seem easy. Rebecca smiled. Kyle had become the undisputed king of the sky. The enemy hadn't expected their rivals to have fighter pilots willing to perform such risky maneuvers. Losing 2 of their planes within minutes concerned them. They didn't have an endless supply of fighter jets, and losing each plane was a significant setback in their progress to turn the tables in their favor. The objective was to take down the Chilean forces in one fell swoop, and they had no intention of retreating. They quickly rallied more planes together and ordered a new squadron to take to the skies. The situation on the Chilean side of the border was chaotic and tense. Rebecca started to fear for everyone involved, as it seemed as if the 2 warring factions were out to annihilate one another mercilessly. Chile was on the defensive, and because Peru had initiated the war, they had been prepared and had strategies in place. On the other hand, Chile had had to scramble to deploy its reinforcements and didn't have as much fighting power as Peru. Kyle's voice crackled over the radio as he gave out new orders to his squadron. Transition into the four-finger formation. Just do exactly what you learned during our training exercises. I'll take the lead. The fighter jets changed their formation and flew toward the Peruvian interior. Rebecca watched as the jets disappeared out of sight, and her heart pounded in her chest. The rebellion in Colombia was nothing compared to the intense war between Chile and Peru. She had thought back then that it was the most terrifying experience, but being in an actual war zone was even worse. Her ears buzzed from the constant sonic booms of the jets and the explosions on the ground. Plumes of smoke filled the air, and the smell of burning rubber stung her nostrils. Injured soldiers were arriving by the dozens, all requiring urgent medical attention. Rebecca had to pull her eyes away from the sky and focus on why she was there. A heavily injured soldier had been wheeled toward the medical tent on a gurney. The soldier pushing him looked bewildered. Rebecca quickly pulled herself together. I've got him. Go back and get the others. A bomb had hit the wounded soldier's squad, and many had been killed. Rebecca hurried him into the medical tent, and her eyes widened as she surveyed the scene. A score of injured soldiers writhed and groaned in pain as exhausted doctors did their best to attend to them. Rebecca tried to block out the constant sound of war from outside and coiled her hair into a tight bun before sliding her hands into a fresh pair of latex gloves. She lowered her head and focused on her patient. Soon, another soldier was brought in, and she heard someone say, "It's a pilot. He took out 4 enemy planes and ejected just as his plane was shot down." Rebecca's heart sank. She quickly wrapped a bandage around the patient's wounds and gestured for a nurse to take over. She then hurried over to the pilot who had just been brought in. To her relief, his face was unfamiliar, but her heart broke when she saw that he had lost a leg and was close to bleeding to death. Several doctors rushed to attend to him, and Rebecca stepped out of their way. She was about to tend to another patient when she heard one of the doctors cry out in alarm. "He's bleeding out! He needs surgery!" She looked over and saw that the pilot's femoral artery had been severed. The makeshift field hospital had limited supplies, and they didn't have the facilities to perform intricate surgery. The only thing Rebecca could think of was to use skills Helga had taught her. So she rushed over to apply pressure to specific parts of the pilot's lower abdomen. The pressure slowed the bleeding, but it didn't stop it. Rebecca tried to press down at the pilot's hip joint, but the effect was minimal. She began to feel flustered and was afraid the pilot would die. Suddenly, she heard a calm voice beside her. "Let me try." She turned her head, shocked to see Dr. Shananahan. He wasn't wearing his white lab coat. Instead, he wore plain civilian clothing and looked casual, as if he had been out for a walk. Dr. Shananahan stood opposite Rebecca and pressed his delicate fingers against the pilot's abdomen. Rebecca mirrored his movements, and they worked together in silence. His hands were stronger than hers, and he was able to apply more pressure. He also had an excellent understanding of human anatomy, so he could quickly identify where to apply the pressure. The other doctors were shocked as they watched Dr. Shananahan and Rebecca work on the patient. No one knew who the handsome stranger was, but there was no time for questions. Within a few minutes, the patient's bleeding had decreased enough for the doctors to start stitching him up. Rebecca stepped back and gazed at Dr. Shananahan. She wondered where he had come from and if he had explicitly gone over to help. It didn't make any sense. The war had broken out because of the reagent formula that he had developed. He had spearheaded the research and had in-depth knowledge of how to manufacture the formula. Of all the people in Chile, he should have been the most sought-after person by the Peruvian army. Capturing him would be equivalent to obtaining the formula. Dr. Shananahan looked calm and collected. Although his gloves were stained with blood, he still looked clean and pure, as if he was casually chatting to friends about the weather. His skill was outstanding, and he quickly attended to more patients. Rebecca didn't know if he had brought any particular medication, but he seemed to stabilize every patient he came into contact with effortlessly. One soldier started going into cardiac arrest, and Dr. Shananahan pumped his fist against the patient's chest until his heartbeat returned to normal. Rebecca watched in awe. She hoped he was genuine, not another infiltrator working for the enemy. The battle in the sky intensified, and the attacks on the forces on the ground became more frenzied. An endless stream of wounded soldiers flooded the medical tent. The doctors worked tirelessly to stabilize them while they waited to be transported to a military hospital far away from the war zone. The night was long, and no one got any sleep. Rebecca had finished treating her fourth batch of wounded soldiers and took a moment to gaze at Dr. Shananahan. He had just completed stitching a large wound on a patient's arm and looked up to catch Rebecca's gaze. He smiled at her. Rebecca smiled back and wiped the sweat on her forehead. "I'm sure this has been hard on you." Although they were on the same side, she didn't want to expose Dr. Shananahan's identity. He nodded. He peeled the latex gloves off and threw them into the hazardous waste bin. He walked over to her and spoke softly. "Will you be back?" She instantly understood what he meant, and she smiled. "I don't think so." Although she wanted to learn more about the biomanufacturing facility and the research they did, she had to return to the army. She still wanted to learn many things, but realized she couldn't do it all. Instead of jumping from one thing to the next, she had to pick something and focus on it. She had responsibilities, and she had to honor them. Dr. Shananahan put his hands into his pocket. "I have something for you." He handed her a small bottle with white powder in it. "This is very useful for external injuries. Just sprinkle a tiny amount over the wound. It'll prevent inflammation and bacterial infection." Rebecca's eyes lit up as she clasped the small bottle. "Thank you." She looked at him and hesitated before asking, "Why are you giving this to me?" "Because you might need it." She nodded and gazed at him with large almond-shaped eyes. "Was it you who knocked me out when I saw Jeremy and Katana in the hallway?" He looked slightly startled. "Yeah." Rebecca frowned. "So, you already knew that Jeremy was trouble?" He shook his head. "No, not really. I had my suspicions. But then you and Kyle came along, and everything fell into place." Rebecca's mouth twitched. Dr. Shananahan had just said Kyle instead of Kylan. Rebecca raised her eyebrows and looked directly into Dr. Shananahan's eyes. "Why are you here?" He held her gaze without flinching. "To bring you medicine." He neatened his shirt and smoothed his hair. "I have to go back now." "You can't go back by yourself. It's too dangerous. You know what I mean." "Don't worry. I'll be fine. I'll go back the way I came." Dr. Shananahan turned around to leave. Rebecca called out behind him, and he turned his head. "Take care." She watched him disappear into the night, and her thoughts ran wild. How did he get through the front lines without any harm? Did he especially come to bring the medicine to me? And why? Maybe he likes me? No, that's outrageous. What if we're somehow related? Or perhaps I once saved someone close to him? Rebecca couldn't figure it out, but she didn't have time to mull it over because another group of wounded soldiers had arrived and needed urgent attention. The night seemed endless. Flashes of missiles and balls of fire dotted the dark sky as the battle raged. Rebecca had no news of Kyle. She focused on tending to the wounded as they poured in from the border. The hours passed as the exhausted doctors rotated shifts. The sun rose, and the day passed in a blur. The sun had started to dip behind the horizon again as Rebecca's shift ended. She walked out of the medical tent in a daze. It felt as though her world was spinning, and her head ached. She sat down and leaned her back against some crates stacked nearby. Tired and drained, she stretched her legs and closed her eyes. Rebecca slept soundly, and the bright moon was shining in the dark sky when she woke. Small stars sparkled, and the sounds of war seemed to have died down. She gazed at the sky and saw 3 stars forming a straight line. They reminded her of her 2 brothers. They were the Davis triplets, the star children of the Davis Empire. Suddenly, she heard voices. "We've pushed the enemy back. The tables have turned in our favor." She quickly pushed herself up and saw an SUV driving toward the medical tent. She could tell from the insignia painted on the side of the vehicle that it had come from the front lines. It was the first time since the war had begun that they were on the winning end of it. The SUV was most likely transporting fighter pilots who had ended their shifts. She smoothed her hair and dusted herself off before hurrying over. A crowd of soldiers and other army personnel had gathered around the SUV to welcome the victorious heroes. Their excited cheers momentarily drowned out the depressing atmosphere that had surrounded the base camp after the loss of so many lives. Rebecca started to jog, but when she got close, she slowed down. She waited in anticipation to see who had climbed out of the SUV. Then she saw him. The bright moonlight reflected off his uniform, making him stand out in the crowd. But as always, he kept a low profile and walked behind everyone else. Rebecca's heart began to beat faster, and she held her breath as she looked at Kyle through the noisy crowd gathered around him and the other pilots. He glanced over and saw her. Soldiers bustled past him, but he kept his eyes on her, walking slowly but steadily toward her. Finally, less than 20 feet separated them. He smiled and opened his arms. "Becky, come here." Rebecca walked closer, but she kicked him in the shin instead of falling into his arms. Kyle hadn't expected Rebecca to kick him and hadn't been able to dodge her in time. His entire body was sore from hours of fighting, and the impact of her steel-capped boot against his shin hurt. The corner of his mouth twitched, and he frowned. What was that for? Although she had been worried about his safety, and seeing him gave her an enormous sense of relief, her pent-up anger had resurfaced, and she turned around to leave. She was still angry at him for knocking her out and sending her back to America with her father. The whole issue had been working on her nerves, and she had spent days mulling it over. She had even wondered if he had presumed that the only reason she had wanted to stay was because of him and nothing else. Not even her sense of duty or willingness to be part of the greater good. She had remained annoyed at him the whole time. She had gone to join the war effort to prove to him that no one could tell her what to do. She would come and go as she pleased and wasn't reliant on anyone. Seeing him made her even angrier, and she stormed off, walking faster and faster until she finally reached the side of a ruined building. Kyle was stunned. He struggled helplessly and hurried after her. She had come to a dead end and couldn't go any further. She was irritated, but also had a nagging feeling she was being immature. She continued to ignore him as she clambered up a section of cement slab. Kyle caught up with her and stood beside the slab, making him slightly shorter than her. He looked up at her with dark eyes. "Becky, are you angry at me?" She ignored him. Kyle sighed and began to unbutton his shirt. Rebecca glared at him and gritted her teeth. "What does he think he's doing? Trying to seduce me isn't going to help." Kyle removed his camouflage shirt and revealed a sweat-stained white vest. He spread his arms wide and grinned at her. "There's too much protective gear on my shirt that can hurt you. Now you can beat me up without damaging your delicate little hands." The bright moonlight made his skin glow, accentuating his toned muscles under his tight vest, making him seem lithe yet strong. She took a deep breath. "Are you sure you want me to fight you?" He nodded. "Yeah, if it'll help you get everything out of your system." Without hesitating, she clenched her fists and pounded his chest. He didn't move. He stood firm and grinned at her. His entire body ached from the effects of the constant G-force against it, and his muscles burned. The beating of her tiny fists felt a gentle massage in comparison. She punched him harder, and the more he grinned, the angrier she became. Her fists started to hurt, so she resorted to kicking him instead. His grin disappeared, and he frowned at her, but she couldn't see clearly in the moonlight and didn't notice. All she could think of was how smug he seemed. She reached into her pocket and took out a small syringe filled with a sedative. "This will knock you out." Kyle chuckled. "My little Bex, I don't think you should mess around like that. Her eyes widened in surprise. What did he just call me? He gave her a half shrug. How do you plan on getting me back to the base if you knock me out? We can return to the base if you're a good little girl. But if you really want to be a naughty little girl, I suppose you can knock me out right here and do whatever you want with me. She glared at him, and her mouth gaped open, but she didn't say anything. Kyle sighed and stepped closer to her. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to hurt you. She snorted. Is that so? But you did, and I'm not over it. He knew his teasing was making her angrier. In reality, though, he didn't need much force to make her faint again. My little Bax, come here so I can kiss it better for you. Rebecca clenched her fists in irritation. Since when am I your little Bax? Kyle's eyes glistened in the moonlight as he smiled. Since I just made it up right now. Rebecca clicked her tongue in frustration. Hours earlier, Kyle had been racing across the sky, shooting down enemy aircraft. Now he was standing beside her in a sweat-stained white vest, teasing her like a small child. She tried to look angry, but her lips curled into a soft smile. Kyle saw her smile and leaned forward to take her down from the cement slab. She struggled and kicked against his body. His arms tightened and his back stiffened as he coughed. All right, calm down. I'm injured, and my body hurts. She lowered her head and gazed at him. Where? You're just wearing a vest and I don't see anything. He looked at her with a deadpan expression. Becky, you're smart enough to know that I might have to remove more clothing to reveal my injuries. She gasped. I can't believe he's so shameless. She narrowed her eyes and dropped her gaze toward his belt buckle. She pretended to be shocked. Oh no! Have you become a eunuch? Kyle's face darkened briefly and then he grinned. Yeah, maybe. I'm not sure. I think I need your professional opinion. You'll have to examine me in private. He emphasized his last sentence and winked. Rebecca's ears turned red, but she held her composure. That won't be necessary. I should be able to just tell by looking at you like this. I mean, I've heard. Her voice trailed off, and she wiggled her eyebrows. He carried her in his arms and lowered his head. Their faces almost touched, and he murmured into her ear. What have you heard? She looked into his eyes. Well, since you guys don't have any cubicles in the men's bathrooms. She stopped mid-sentence and flashed him a naughty smile. He tried his best not to react, but his eyes widened, shocked that she would make such an elusive reference. He cleared his throat. Yeah, okay. Rebecca suddenly remembered something and became serious. I saw Dr. Shenanahan today. Kyle frowned. Dr. Shenanahan? Her eyes lit up. Yeah, I could barely believe it myself. But what worried me is that he called you Kyle. Kyle's body stiffened. He stopped walking and put her down. So you think he knows? Rebecca shrugged. I don't know, but it seems like it. Kyle glared at her. Exactly what were you two talking about? Not much, but he called you Kyle, so he must know the truth. I might just have to pay him a visit at the facility. Where did you see him? He came into the medical tent while I was on duty treating wounded soldiers. He helped us, and he also saved many lives. She reached into her pocket and took out a small bottle. He gave me this. It's similar to something I once made using one of Helga's traditional medicine recipes. It prevents inflammation and bacterial infection in open wounds. Kyle raised his eyebrows suspiciously and had a sarcastic tone in his voice. Do you want me to believe that he came unannounced, out of nowhere, just to give you a bottle of medicine? Sensing his jealous tone, Rebecca quickly recounted what had happened the day before, and the conversation she had had with Dr. Shenanahan. Kyle listened and remained silent. He then took a step forward and put his arm around her waist. He pulled her closer to him and pressed his forehead against hers. Becky, What am I going to do with you? She battered her eyelashes coquettishly. I suppose you'll just have to do whatever you think best. Kyle chortled. Yeah. I think we should rather speak about something else. Rebecca's flirting drove Kyle crazy. They had played husband and wife in the scene they had done at the Mid-Autumn Festival talent show, and they had pretended to be dating while they were at the biomanufacturing facility. But because the mission had ended, Kyle had to return to waiting for Rebecca to be old enough to date him. She seemed to read his thoughts. We said 2 years, and it's only been half a year. Kyle laughed. Yeah, compared to the 6 months of probation required to secure a 3-year contract with the Gonzalez Group, another 1.5 years for a lifelong contract with you isn't that long. Rebecca gasped, surprised he would be so presumptuous about their future together. She lowered her eyes, not sure how to respond. He cupped her chin and lowered his head to kiss her. She lifted her mouth toward him, with her lips slightly parted, expecting to feel the warmth of his breath against her skin. When suddenly, Kyle bit her. She pulled her head back and yelped. You just bit me! He nodded. I nibbled you. I don't like strange doctors giving you gifts. She stared at him with wide eyes. Becky, I've already told you I'm the jealous type, especially over a beautiful woman like you. The moon was shining brightly in the night sky, and his body made a long shadow against the ruined buildings. She sighed and rubbed her lip. How's your injury? Does it hurt badly? Yeah, it's sore. Maybe you should treat me with some of the medicine Dr. Shanahan gave you. We could go to my tent. Rebecca felt as if she was destined to have endured his teasing, no matter what she said or did. He took her by the hand and led her back toward the base camp. His squad had already set up his tent, and they watched with bemused smiles as he unzipped the front panel and held it aside for Rebecca to enter. She wanted to stop and explain, but the words got stuck in her throat, and she blushed. It was dark inside the tent, with only the moonlight shining through the small mesh windows, throwing a gentle light on the military-style camping cot. Kyle closed the flap and pulled his white vest over his head before throwing it onto the camping cot. Rebecca looked down at the ground. Hey, don't forget I'm in here with you. She gazed back up at him and noticed he had turned his back to her, revealing his slim waist. She also saw a large gaping wound running across his back. She frowned and shook her head. Why didn't you tell me you've been badly hurt? You let me hit you while you're in this condition? She gestured for him to lie down. He grinned at her as he lay down on his stomach. You didn't really hurt me with your little girl punches. Annoyed, she hissed at him and opened a small canister on a foldable table. She poured water over a face cloth and wrung it out before gently dabbing it over the dried blood on his skin. As she wiped his back clean, she felt his top muscles under his smooth skin. She massaged his back softly. Relax. You're very tense. Rebecca was annoyed because he teased her all the time. He turned his neck to face sideways. How do you expect me to relax if there's a beautiful vixen like you in my tent? She smiled but didn't reply. Instead, she took the medicine bottle out of her pocket and unscrewed the lid. Then, she carefully sprinkled the medicine over his wound, covering all the exposed flesh. She suddenly had a thought. Do you think Dr. Shanahan's medicine is okay to use? What if he's given me something else? Kyle grunted. I don't think he'd be that stupid. Sure, it's fine. Rebecca sighed. Who do you think he is? I have no idea. His background check seemed fine. There wasn't anything unusual about him. He came from a regular middle-class family, worked hard at school, and got a few bursaries to study traditional medicine. He went to college, earned his degree, skipped ahead a few years, and obtained his PhD before working for the biomanufacturing facility. Rebecca raised her eyebrows. There's nothing out of the ordinary there. Maybe I'm just paranoid. Yeah, you'd better be a good girl. Puzzled, Rebecca stepped back slightly. What do you mean? I'll have to keep an eye on him. You're my girl. Kyle waited for her to finish treating the wound on his back before he sat on the edge of the bed and began unlacing his boots. He grimaced as he bent over to pull them off. He took a deep breath and stood up to unbutton his trousers. Rebecca recalled her bold, flirtatious remarks as she gazed at his toned body. Feeling hot and flustered, she quickly looked away, resisting the urge to rush out of the tent. Kyle had stripped down and was standing in nothing other than his boxer shorts. She slowly raised her eyes and gasped. "You have burns on your legs." He shrugged. "Yeah, but you should have seen the other guy. He wasn't lucky." She remembered watching him dart across the sky in his jet. It was the most intense and nerve-wracking fighting she had ever witnessed. She felt her chest tighten at the thought of it. She squatted down, unzipped her medical bag, and rummaged around until she found a burn wound ointment and sterile gauze. She gently applied the ointment and covered the wound with sterile gauze before wrapping a bandage around his leg. Kyle didn't say a word, but she could tell by his breathing that he was in pain, and it hurt every time she touched him. When she was finished, she looked up and found him staring at her. He leaned against the camping cot, his lean muscles glimmering in the pale moonlight. He had no fat, and his entire body was perfectly toned, like the stereotypical poster-perfect combat soldier. But unlike his muscular and powerful physique, his eyes seemed soft and gentle. They stood in silence for a long time until Kyle finally spoke. "Becky, do you know what I'm thinking about?" She shook her head. "What are you thinking about?" "I can't make you do anything you don't want to. I can't control you, even if I knock you out and send you away. You always seem to find your way back to me." He leaned closer to her and ran his rough finger along her high cheekbone. "I want to..." His voice trailed off briefly. "I want you to be with me wherever I go. I want to ensure you're always by my side, no matter what." He opened his palm and ran his hand down the nape of her neck. The roughness of his skin against hers gave her goosebumps, and she bit her bottom lip. "Aren't you afraid of taking me on dangerous missions with you?" He sighed. "The future is so uncertain. When we wake up to the rising sun, we never know if we'll die in an accident before it reaches its highest point in the sky, or live to see it setting below the horizon." He put his strong arms around her and hugged her tightly. "I only want to be with you. If you die, I hope to die too. Let's live our lives together. As long as you're brave, I'll take you wherever I go." Her breathing quickened as she listened to him, and she felt her heart swell. She looked up at him with her large, almond-shaped eyes. "It's like when we were kids. We were punished because we were naughty whenever we saw each other. But it didn't feel like a punishment, because we got the same punishment and had to do it together." Kyle chuckled. "Yeah, it's exactly like that. It doesn't matter what happens, just as long as we're together." She pressed her head against his chest and listened to the rhythmic beating of his heart. His muscles flexed and relaxed as he stroked her hair. She smelled the sweat on his skin, and her body burned with desire. Kyle slowly released her from his embrace. "You have to go now. The others are probably watching my tent to see how long you've been here." As much as he yearned to be with her, he also had her reputation to consider and didn't want any slanderous gossip about her making the rounds. She nodded and checked the dressing on his wounds one last time before opening the tent flap. She gazed into his dark eyes. "Sweet dreams." He smiled at her. "You too, my little Bex." She glared at him and slid out between the tent flaps. Rebecca walked back toward the medical tent, smiling until she suddenly realized she had left her medical bag behind in Kyle's tent. She spun around and hurried back. She peeked through the tent flap and was about to call out when she noticed him lying stretched out on the uncomfortable camping cot. His breathing was slow and steady, and he was fast asleep. Rebecca was surprised to see Kyle fast asleep. He lay motionless, wearing his boxer shorts and nothing else. She quietly folded the tent flap back to allow some of the moonlight in as she waited for her eyes to grow accustomed to the dim light. She tiptoed into the tent, carefully reached for her medical bag and slung it over her shoulder. She gazed at his peaceful face. His eyes were closed, and his eyelashes fluttered slightly. Rebecca sighed. Kyle had spent hours relentlessly fighting the enemy and hadn't shown her any signs of being tired while they had chatted beside the ruined building, or even when she had dressed his wounds. Yet he had fallen asleep the moment she had left, too tired to cover himself before he closed his eyes. She quietly leaned over, covered him with a thin blanket, and closed the tent flap as she left. Unfortunately for Kyle and all the other exhausted soldiers, being in the middle of war didn't allow them much time to sleep. After a few short hours, one of his squad members called loudly to wake him up. The Chilean reinforcements had arrived. The enemy troops were advancing quickly, and every able-bodied soldier had been called for duty. The Chilean forces had to concentrate all their firepower to drive the Peruvian mercenaries away. The sun had just risen, and the base was a hive of activity as the soldiers scrambled to prepare for the front line. Rebecca set off with the medical team and didn't get a chance to speak to Kyle. He and the other pilots had already zoomed off in an SUV toward the airfield. A thick cloud of dust filled the air as the mobilized troops headed into battle. Layla and Sean had slept poorly among the ruins. Their injuries hurt, and it had been cold during the night. Exhausted and sore, they woke up to the sound of explosions. They peered out from beneath a broken cement slab and found a formation of fighter jets shooting across the sky. The sonic boom of their jet engines echoed in the air, making Layla's ears ache. Then, they saw a squadron of helicopters in the distance. As the tiny black dots grew bigger, Sean realized that the army was approaching, and their hiding place was no longer safe. They didn't know which side was on the attack and which was on the defense, but it was clear that the ruined town they were hiding in was being targeted. A bomb exploded in a building not too far away from them. Layla saw someone dressed in military fatigues scramble out of the rubble as thick black smoke filled the air. Terrified, they both knew it was only a matter of time before the ground troops would arrive. They were unarmed and had no experience of war. They didn't know what to do or which way to turn. Sean gestured toward another ruined building. "We're not safe here. Let's try to get to that building. It's already a pile of rubble, so hopefully it won't be targeted." Layla nodded. Her eyes were red and swollen, but her tears had dried up. They crawled on the dirt, trying to keep in the shadows of the debris. They heard the rumble of SUVs rapidly approaching and quickly hid in a small gap formed by a wall that had fallen over. Thick dust filled their lungs, and they struggled to breathe. The convoy of SUVs raced past them, filling the air with more dust. The rattling of gunfire echoed in the air, becoming more intense as the minutes ticked by. Layla wailed with fear. "Sean, what are we going to do?" It seemed like they were trapped between the two warring sides. Grenades were exploding and missiles were whistling through the air. The noise was deafening. Sean's eyes darted as he looked around. "We have to find somewhere safe to hide. Let's keep going. We're civilians, so hopefully they won't attack us, but we can't stay here." Layla nodded. She took a deep breath, grabbed Sean's hand, and ran into the open with him. Fresh, warm tears streamed down her cheeks as they hurried toward their next hiding spot. As a fighter jet sped overhead, a long howling sound suddenly ripped through the air. The plane tore through the sky, breaking through the enemy's defense lines, and seemed to aim straight at them. A missile whizzed above their heads and destroyed a tall block of abandoned apartments at the far end of the town. The Peruvian forces taking cover in the building were killed instantly. Bruno raced across the dusty, debris-filled road and shouted at his men. "Stop the car! We have to get out and split up. Take cover where you can." He hadn't expected the Chilean fighter jet to break past the ground-to-air missiles and attack the town. The mercenaries dressed in black uniforms with the golden python insignia sewn onto their shoulders hurried to find somewhere safe to hide. They were exceptionally well trained and disappeared within seconds. Bruno slid behind a cement slab and prepared to attack. Suddenly, he saw two figures run into the open in clear view of everyone. His heart skipped a beat as he recognized them. It was the same two people who had been hiding in the store. This time, though, he could see the woman's face and immediately knew who it was. He blinked and cursed under his breath. The woman's face was covered in dust, but Bruno recognized her immediately. It was Layla, without a doubt. Bruno's heart leaped, and he gasped in shock. He couldn't believe his eyes. He wondered how she had ended up in the middle of a war zone, out in the remote desert. He could see the terror in her eyes as his thoughts raced. Is she injured? How did she get through the night? He wished he had confronted the two figures when he had seen them crouching in the corner of the store. He should have taken a closer look. He would have recognized her then already. Layla and Sean were holding hands as they ran across the road. The sky behind them had turned a fiery red from the burning buildings. Bruno watched in horror. It was as though they didn't care anymore. Their survival instincts had kicked in, and all they could think about was running for cover. He took a deep breath and sprinted toward them. His subordinate's voice crackled in his earpiece. "Deputy Commander, where are you going?" "Stay where you are." He was swift and agile. He leapt over bits of debris as he hurried toward Layla and Sean. His movements attracted the attention of a team of Chilean soldiers, and they started to shoot at him. Bullets whizzed past his ear and shot toward Layla. Bruno cursed, realizing that he was putting her in even more danger. Even though it was obvious that she and Sean were just two terrified civilians, it was also clear that he wasn't. His black uniform with the golden python emblem was a dead giveaway. Suddenly, an artillery shell hurtled through the air. Then, the world in front of him exploded. Through the dust and billowing smoke, Bruno saw a piece of shrapnel flying straight toward Layla. She was running for her life, unaware of what was happening behind her. The next moment, the shrapnel struck her, and she collapsed. Her limp body lay motionless in the dirt. Sean tried to pull her up, but he couldn't because his dislocated arm had no strength. He wanted to lift her over his shoulder, but it was impossible. He grabbed her under her arms and cried out in despair as he tried to carry her toward the ruined building. Another plane skimmed over the town, releasing a hail of bullets as it scooped back into the sky. The heat of the jet engines burned into the ground, and Layla suddenly opened her eyes. She squinted in the bright light and gasped for air. She looked at Sean's panic-stricken face. His wide eyes bulged, and he was deathly pale. She focused her eyes to see behind him and saw a soldier with a machine gun chasing after them. Layla felt her heart leap into her throat. It felt as if time had stopped. She looked around, and Sean's figure blurred. The terrifying sounds of war had stopped, and she no longer felt afraid. She felt serene and at peace. "I'm dying." She closed her eyes and stretched out her arm to hug Sean. "I'm so sorry. You wouldn't be here if it weren't for me." Suddenly, she felt a large, strong hand grab her by the arm and lift her off the ground. The man pulled her close to his chest and embraced her tightly. As she began to slip out of consciousness, she smelled gunpowder and blood. Layla was desperate to find out who the stranger was, but she was too weak, and she didn't dare raise her eyes as he grasped her tightly with one hand and shot rounds of bullets with the other. She held her breath, listening to the sound of gunfire all around them and not daring to move. She leaned against the man's chest for protection, and she could feel his heart pounding. There was something disturbingly familiar about him. She thought he had an uncanny resemblance to Bruno, who had lost a lot of weight when he had been in the hospital. The man was just as tall and thin, but unlike Bruno, he was muscular and had a strong, firm chest. She didn't know where he had come from or whether he was with the Peruvian or Chilean army, but she was grateful that he had saved her life. Sean recovered from his temporary shock, and he looked around. He recognized the uniform that the man holding onto Layla was wearing. The man they had seen in the store had been wearing the same one. He quickly ducked behind them to dodge the bullets being fired at them. Layla managed to get enough energy to look up, but she couldn't see the man's face in the dark. "Who are you?" she shouted above the sound of gunfire, but he ignored her. She then looked around for Sean and called out his name. "Layla, I'm right behind you." "Are you okay?" The moment the words were out of her mouth, the man tightened his grip on her. "I'm fine. Don't worry about me," Sean shouted back. He peeked his head around Bruno's shoulder and looked up at him. "Thanks for saving Layla's life. Who are you, by the way? And which side are you on?" Bruno ignored him too. His jaw was set, and his eyes were locked on their enemies. Layla felt faint, and she couldn't stop shaking. She leaned against Bruno's shoulder, and she passed out a moment later. Her last thought before she lost consciousness was that the stranger smelled just like Bruno. He had that familiar scent she loved so much, and she recalled the last night they spent together so many months ago. Bruno pulled her over to the side, careful not to attract too much attention. He carefully laid her down on the ground and examined her. After making sure she wasn't too seriously injured, he ordered 3 of his subordinates to stay with her and take her back to the base if things got too dangerous. They nodded. One of them pointed to Sean. "What about him?" Bruno glanced at Sean and shrugged indifferently. "I really don't care. He can do as he pleases." The 3 men looked at Layla. They could tell she was no ordinary person and that Bruno had some connection to her. They also sensed some sort of rivalry between their deputy commander and Sean. After Bruno finished giving orders, he threw himself back into battle. The battle intensified. When Bruno's men realized things were getting worse, they carried Layla over to the car. Sean, who was scared out of his wits, hurried after them. The mercenaries didn't stop him, letting him climb into the back seat next to Layla. They then got in and drove back to the base. Bruno had advanced to a strategic location where he couldn't be seen, and he was sniping at his enemies. His eyes were locked onto his targets, but his mind was on Layla. As he pulled the trigger, he recalled how she had trembled in his arms just a few minutes earlier, burying her face in his chest. It was the first time in a long time he had thought about her, and his mind drifted further away from the battle. He aimed, fired, and missed. The mistake almost cost him his life. His enemies fired back at him, and he barely managed to dodge the attack. He forced himself to forget about her as bullets whizzed past him. The enemies had discovered his location, and he knew if he wasn't careful, they would kill him. The battle continued. More reinforcements arrived from Chile, forcing the Peruvian army back. When Bruno received orders to retreat, he wiped the blood and sweat from his face and put away his gun. He realized that, as deputy commander of a mercenary group, he couldn't change the outcome of the war. The best he could do was collect his money and make sure he minimized their losses. By that point, the Chilean army had reclaimed the border area that Peru had occupied, and things didn't look good. Bruno returned to his station late that night, relieved to be back. However, as he walked across the compound toward his room, he stopped in his tracks. He suddenly felt nervous about seeing Layla, wondering how she would react when she realized who he was. He knew he was no longer the same person she had grown up with and had once loved. He had hardened, and he had blood on his hands. After he had left the hospital, he had accepted his fate. He had no qualms about killing people for money. But he knew Layla would never accept the person he had become. If she had trouble coming to terms with what he had done back in Cuba, he dreaded finding out how she would take the news that he was now a mercenary. His hand shook as he reached for the doorknob. He felt he didn't have the strength to push it open and see her face. Just then, his phone rang in his pocket. He instantly recognized the ringtone, and he knew who was calling him. He took his phone out and answered. "Boyd, I heard you saved some woman on the battlefield today," he heard Mr. K say. Bruno leaned against the wall and took a deep breath. "Yes, sir, I did." "Don't forget who you are now. You're Boyd, not Bruno." "I haven't forgotten, sir." Mr. K cleared his throat. "I want to remind you of the conversation we had when you joined our group. You have no future with her. You're a mercenary, and you can't afford to be weak and distracted in your line of work. Weakness can cost you your life and put others' lives in danger. You could have died out there on that battlefield because of what you did." Bruno gripped the phone so hard he thought it would break. He felt a heaviness in his chest. He knew Mr. K was right. He had been foolish to let his feelings get the better of him. "That's all I wanted to say," Mr. K continued. "I'll take it she's out of harm's way now, so you can focus on the task at hand. This is a difficult war to fight. Everyone needs to be in top form." After speaking to Mr. K, Bruno stood outside his room for a long time. When his subordinates saw him in the hallway, they went over and gave him a knowing look. One of them winked at him. "We brought her back. She's waiting in your room." "Respect, sir? She's quite the looker." Bruno nodded, and he finally mustered enough courage to go inside. The room was quiet and dark, except for a lamp that was lit on a side table. He looked around. Everything was the same as he had left it days ago, but Layla was lying on his bed at that moment. He tiptoed over and gazed at her for a while. Her hair was loose and covered half her face. Her eyes were closed, and he could hear her steady breathing. He couldn't believe she was right there in front of him. He noticed she had lost weight since the last time he had seen her, and her facial features had become more prominent. She looked just as delicate and beautiful as he remembered her. He noticed she had a scab on her arm, and his heart went out to her. He wondered how she had ended up in the middle of a war. He recalled what Mr. K had told him as he stared at her, and he felt a stabbing pain in his heart. He reached over to tuck her in when he suddenly realized she wasn't wearing anything. Furious, he walked out of the room and confronted his subordinates, who were hanging out in the hallway. They were surprised by the angry look on his face. "Is anything wrong, sir?" Bruno glared at him. "Who took her clothes off?" "It wasn't us. We brought her back to your room and haven't been there since. The cleaning lady must have undressed and showered her." Bruno knew they were lying, but he knew he couldn't prove it. "Just stay the hell away from her." He stormed back to his room and closed the door behind him. His eyes fell on Layla again. He stared at the contours of her face and her neck. He was excited by the thought of her naked. His heartbeat quickened and his breathing became labored. He couldn't take his eyes off her lips. He inched closer to her and stopped just as he was about to kiss her. She looked so innocent and pure, lying on the bed like a porcelain doll. He, on the other hand, was covered in blood and smelled of gunpowder. He was furious with himself for thinking he could get close to her in such a state. He quickly went to the bathroom, took off his clothes, and stood under the shower. He carefully washed himself, but he knew he could never clean his soul. He shook his head with frustration, thinking he had no future with Layla. He decided never to see her again after that night. After sending her back to Cuba as soon as possible, he would return to the battlefield. He dried himself with a towel, put on some clean clothes, and returned to her bedside. He leaned over her, trying to convince himself that he deserved one last kiss. After that, he would devote his life to his mercenary work and never look back. He figured he would eventually die on the battlefield anyway, and everyone would soon forget about him. Mr. K would bury him in a public cemetery somewhere with the name Boyd written on his headstone. Bruno sat on the bed and gently caressed Layla's cheek. He could smell the sweet, alluring scent of her skin. Just as he was about to kiss her, he heard her whisper Sean's name. Bruno froze when he heard Layla mutter Sean's name in her sleep. His lips were still touching hers, and he suddenly felt a bitter taste in his mouth. He never imagined it would be like that, but hearing Sean's name was like a knife piercing through his heart. The moment he had savored was gone. He held his breath, half expecting her to wake up, but she continued sleeping. Her face was so close to his that he could see the small dark shadows under her eyes. The tip of his nose was touching hers, and he could feel her breath on his cheeks. He caressed her again, and he was surprised at how rough his once soft and delicate hands had become. He also noticed the scars on his arm for the first time, realizing that he was a mercenary for life and could never go back to his past life. Layla, however, was still the sweet, gentle, beautiful girl he had left behind. He sighed, thinking their relationship had been doomed from the start. He felt jealous of her life back home. He assumed she had many friends at university and several men chasing after her, including the man whose name she had called out. Bruno wondered about Sean. He could only guess he was someone she cared deeply about, and he felt an emptiness inside. Though he had chosen the mercenary path out of desperation, he had still held on to a glimmer of hope. Layla had been his shining star, lighting up the darkest parts of his soul. But he had realized then that it had been nothing but a dream, and it was too late. She had moved on, taking the light with her. He was grateful that she at least had been with him for the better part of his life. He laughed to himself bitterly, thinking perhaps the universe had taken pity on him. He pursed his lips and kissed her again, but he couldn't shake the feeling that she no longer belonged to him. Her lips had a sweet, salty taste. He reminded himself that it was their last kiss, and that he would never see her again after that night. He was sure she would be better off without him. He couldn't stop kissing her. Her lips were like a magnet that kept pulling him in. As he moved, his hand accidentally caught at her hair, and Layla moved her head. He froze, waiting for her to open her eyes. He hadn't meant to wake her up, and he suddenly became nervous. Layla was still half asleep, but she sensed a familiar aura that reminded her of the past. She tried to open her eyes, but her eyelids felt heavy. As she gradually emerged from her slumber, she could feel someone breathing on her. She woke up with a start, and she found herself staring into the bloodshot eyes of the stranger who had saved her among the ruins. She was too stunned to move, thinking she was dreaming for a split second. It took her several minutes to finally come to her senses. Bruno and Layla stared at one another in silence. It was then that she realized she wasn't dreaming and that she was looking straight at Bruno. Her memories came flooding back like a tidal wave. The sound of his voice, his familiar scent, and the way he had protected her from the gunfire earlier that day left no doubt in her mind that it was him. The last thing she had expected was to see Bruno under such circumstances. After searching for him in vain for over 6 months, she had given up. Bruno slowly sat up and propped himself against a pillow. She took a good look at him in the lamplight, and she noticed his hair had been cropped. He was just as thin as before, but more muscular. His once fragile, delicate face had a hardness about it, and his features had become sharper. His eyes were red, but they had a depth she had never seen before, as if they were hiding some dark secret. The scar on his cheek made him look tough and somewhat evil. He held himself upright and had an intimidating aura. He was still Bruno, but he had drastically changed, and she felt an incredible, inexplicable sense of loss at that moment. She wished she was happy to see him. She had been looking for him for such a long time, hoping he was still alive somewhere. But the man staring back at her was not the man she wanted. Her sixth sense told her that they were farther away from each other than ever, even though he had risked his life to save her earlier, even though she had just woken up to find his lips on hers. She wanted to speak, but her mouth was dry, and she had nothing to say to him. The longer she stayed silent, the more nervous Bruno became. He could see the disappointment in her eyes, and he tried to convince himself that it was for the best that she would forget about him. After all, he was a mercenary who could very well be dead the next day. He didn't want Layla to mourn him. He only wished her happiness. But no matter how much he tried to reason with himself, he felt like someone had ripped out his heart and stomped on it. The pain was infinitely worse than the months of grueling training he had gone through, and the injuries he had suffered in battle. He thought that even death and torture were better than the unbearable pain he felt at that moment. He took a deep breath, gazing steadily at her. He knew he had to break the silence, so he smiled ever so slightly. "Hi, Layla. Long time no see." Hearing him call her by her name sounded strange to her. She had imagined their reunion so many times in her head, but it was never that. She had hoped he would return to Havana one day, take her in his arms, and explain that he had left because he thought that she had given up on him. He would then declare his undying love for her and ask her to marry him. She nodded meekly, not quite knowing how to respond. "Yeah, it's been a while." Bruno got up, walked over to his closet, and picked out some clothes. He then laid them on the bed. "Here, you can put these on for the time being. I'll ask the cleaner to wash her clothes. Layla nodded and took the clothes that Bruno handed her. Okay, thank you. She looked at Bruno and then realized she wasn't wearing anything. She gasped, but he had already turned away. I'll disappear for now, but tell me when you're done dressing. The clothes are probably a bit big, but it's the best I can do, given that we're all men. All right. She nodded again, and he quickly left. Layla held her head high in an effort to stem the tears that threatened to flow. She stood as tall and strong as she could to steel herself against giving in to her emotions, and she took a few deep breaths. She put on the clothes that he had found for her. They consisted of a t-shirt and a pair of pants, and they were definitely both too big. The pants had a tie around the waist that she could tighten, and she rolled them up at the bottom. She knotted the t-shirt at the waist. Although being Bruno's, she had barely been able to bring herself to put it on. As she put on the pair of slippers and got off the bed, she inhaled his familiar fresh scent and was once again enveloped by sadness. Outside, Bruno asked his colleagues for a cigarette. By the time he had finished it and returned to his room, Layla was fully clothed. He moved toward her slowly and used all his willpower not to pull him into his embrace. Why are you here? Layla swallowed her misery and recounted the situation she had found herself in, which made her think of Sean. Did you save my friend too? Where is he? Bruno had thought he was numb to any more pain, but her words stabbed into his heart. He tried to speak as casually as possible. He's in another room. He's fine. Layla nodded. I'm worried about my brother. I think he's in trouble. I'll help you investigate. Thank you. She looked curiously at him. Bruno, when did you join the army? The familiar use of his name made his heart ache all over again. He paused for a couple of seconds to gather himself before he explained. It's not the army. It's a mercenary group. Layla had heard of such things, but she didn't know much about how they operated. What's that? Who's in charge? We just follow our employer's orders. She looked closely at the scar on his cheek. Why did you join a group like that? She continued before he could answer. When I left the hospital after visiting you, I planned to go back and see you the next day. Something happened to my family. Bruno locked eyes with her as he heard the shouts in his head. He didn't let her say any more. Yes, I know. As she looked at him, she could tell that he didn't want to recall the past. Her heart sank as she realized that the past wasn't important to him. She believed that he no longer loved her because he thought that she had given up on him. The fact that he hadn't replied to any of the messages that she had sent him had confirmed it for her. I'll get you out of the country tonight before a large-scale war breaks out, he said. As for Reggie, I'll dig a bit deeper and see what I can find out. Okay, Layla nodded. They fell silent until Bruno's colleague knocked on the door. Everything's ready. We're good to go. Bruno stood rooted on the spot, and Layla looked at him questioningly. Are we leaving now? He snapped back to reality and nodded. He noticed that she was in slippers and retrieved her shoes from a cabinet nearby. It was fortunate that they were sports shoes. They were muddy, but still very usable. He squatted down and put the shoes in front of her. Here you go. She slid her feet in and was about to tie the laces when she realized that he was still down there and that he was going to do it for her. The calm demeanor that she had been trying so hard to maintain was shattered by that simple act, and tears rolled down her face. They came so suddenly that she didn't have time to cover them up. Bruno looked up when he felt a droplet fall on his forehead. Even in the dim light, he could see that she was crying. His heart constricted painfully. He moved without thinking as he stood up and touched her face gently. He spoke just as softly. What's wrong with my Layla? She peered at him through her blurred vision. She trembled, and her voice was choked with sobs. Why didn't you reply to my messages? His entire body stiffened, except for the hand caressing her face. Why didn't I reply? He thought. He couldn't say it aloud, But it was because all of his means of contact had been given to Mr. K as soon as he stepped into the manor. Layla studied the face that was so familiar and yet seemed so distant. She suddenly felt angry. Is it because I left you at the hospital? I went back to look for you, but you had already been discharged. Bruno still didn't speak. He used all his strength to maintain his calm exterior. He didn't dare move, as he knew that the exterior was fragile and would break with the slightest provocation. Layla was impatient for a reply. Why are you a mercenary? You haven't answered me. He stayed silent. Because of money? She asked. Havana Polytech is very good. A graduate has good earning power. Frustrated at his lack of response, she grabbed his collar. Tell me, why? Bruno finally found his voice, but it had none of the emotion that hers carried. Because I needed excitement. She froze and stared blankly at the man in front of her. She was still shaking. I'd say you've found enough of that. Are you coming back home? He looked at her face, which was covered in tears. He felt them on his skin and knew that his strength was waning. He stared at her and could see all of her struggles and sorrow, but he shook his head. No. Layla had nothing left at that point, and she slowly let go of his collar. She quietly backed away and heard herself speak as if from afar. Really? Let me ask you again. Are you coming home? She had told herself that she would wait for him for 5 years. It had only been 6 months, so she knew that she would stay the course. She got the same answer. I'm not going back. He looked at her seriously for a long time before he continued. Take care of yourself, Layla. Her somewhat hopeful expression slowly faded. She raised her head high again. All right, I understand. You take care too. Okay. Bruno had no other reply. Bruno's fellow mercenary called to him from outside the room again. The other one's ready, sir. Bring him out. We'll send them away together. Bruno then looked at Layla. I'll just change my clothes. She nodded and went to the bathroom while he changed. In the mirror, she could see the tears that hadn't yet dried on her face. Her eyes were red and she felt embarrassed. She forced herself to smile, but it looked insincere and awkward. She heard Bruno talking again. I'm done. She gave herself a mental shake to prepare herself to see him again. She straightened her clothes and went back out. He had changed into the uniform of his group. It was black and it starkly outlined his figure. The golden python embroidery on his shoulder seemed particularly prominent. He looked like someone completely different from the man she remembered. He was still tall, but his expression was unreadable. He somehow managed to look both aloof and intense at the same time. She walked behind him in her flat sports shoes, which made him seem even taller and more unfamiliar under the evening sky. He walked with a straight back, but in her mind, it only made him look arrogant and lonely. Bruno's colleague had been going to say something about how short his time alone with Layla had been, but he swallowed his words when he saw the look on Bruno's face. It wasn't long before Sean was brought out to join them. He had only sustained light injuries, and his wounds had already been treated. He had slept, which had improved his overall spirit a lot. Unlike Layla, he was wearing the same clothes he had worn on arrival. There were a few places that were torn, and it made him look dirty and slovenly compared to those in uniform. When he saw Layla behind Bruno, he quickly ran over. How are you? I'm fine. It was only then that he noticed she was wearing men's clothes. His expression changed, and he looked worriedly at Bruno. Layla immediately understood what he was thinking. It's not what you think. Because she had spoken so quietly, Bruno didn't know what she had said. He again put in a monumental effort to restrain his emotions as he watched the two of them standing so close to one another. He felt jealous that she seemed to have a close relationship with another man. It made him feel like an extra in her life, and he didn't like that at all. The tears that had fallen from her eyes were still burning his skin, and he believed that it would be in her best interest for him to remain uninvolved with her. He cleared his throat. Let's go. They all got into the car together. Bruno sat in the back with Layla beside him. Sean and the other mercenary sat in the front. The mercenary in the front started the car and drove off into the night. The road was bumpy, and Layla's legs knocked into Bruno's from time to time. Being so close to him, she could see that there were guns and knives tucked inside his boots. She inched away from him because she felt a little uncomfortable. Bruno noticed her movement and was about to say something when his demeanor suddenly changed. In the next second, he took out a gun and shot out of the window. At the same time, he used one hand to tightly wrap around Layla's soft body. He then blasted a few more rounds. The car had been specially reinforced, and they could hear all the bullets that were coming at them bouncing off. Layla didn't dare move and enjoyed the sensation of Bruno's heartbeat against her. The lights of the car had been turned off, and the clouds in the sky blocked the moon. It was pitch black. The air smelled like gunfire, although the shooting had temporarily ceased. "Charge at them," Bruno instructed the driver. "Okay, boss." The other mercenary turned on his lights, and they saw a modified car rushing past a bridge in front of them. They drove over the bridge, turned off the lights again, and became one with the darkness. Bruno spoke quietly. "It's another lot of mercenaries hired by the Riqueza group. Keep driving, but pay attention. There may be more." Layla had been in Bruno's arms all that time. When she heard the names of the various consortiums, she couldn't help but worry for him. She hadn't known that there were so many factions, and wondered how typical the gunfight they had just been in was. They had made it through the enemy's barricade. Bruno believed that the other party wasn't sure who they were dealing with, and that they wouldn't give chase in the dark. Layla realized that things had calmed down, so she tried to sit back up. As she did so, she felt a hand on her back. She froze. Bruno applied pressure to keep her down low, and he rested his chin on top of her head. "There might be danger ahead. Don't move." Layla didn't speak or move a muscle. They did face many dangers on their journey, and she stayed in Bruno's arms through it all. In the darkness, neither of them knew what to say, but both of them secretly hoped that time would slow a little. They drove at full speed and made short work of any issues, so it was only an hour and a half before they arrived at the airport in the middle of Peru. Bruno looked down at Layla, still in his arms, and cleared his throat. "We're here." Although that meant that it was time for her to get up, he was still hugging her tightly. She moved slightly, and only then did he relax his grip. The car stopped in front of a helicopter, and everyone clamored out. A man who looked to be in his 40s walked over and hugged Bruno. "Long time no see." "Indeed." They exchanged pleasantries before Bruno got down to business. "My two friends were kidnapped. I need to get them out of the country." The man nodded. "No problem." He looked at Layla and Sean and smiled. "They're just children." Bruno smiled back and lit a cigar for his friend before doing the same for himself. "We'll drink together after the mission is over." Layla watched the male bonding ritual with interest. The smoke and the car lights together obscured Bruno's face and created an air of mystery. She could smell the tobacco on his body when he came back toward her and leaned in to talk. "When you arrive, there'll be someone waiting to take you home. Don't run away." She nodded to show that she had heard the instructions. The pilot was already in the helicopter, and he had put on his headset. "We're ready to go." Layla held her breath as she looked at the helicopter and then back at Bruno. A rare smile appeared on his face. It was gentle, but there was an element of sadness. She was taken back to a time many years earlier when she had seen the same expression. "You should go," he said. Layla nodded and followed Sean into the chopper. Bruno stood stock still as he watched them disappear inside. He didn't even notice when the cigar that he was holding burned the tip of his finger. The rotor blades had started to spin when he saw Layla through the window, looking at him quietly. Because of the distance and the dim light, he couldn't see her face clearly, although her eyes seemed to glint at him. He put one hand into his pocket and tried to look indifferent. He wondered if it was the last time that he would ever see her again. The helicopter took off and quickly disappeared from sight. It was then that he realized that his fingertips were burning painfully. He threw away the remnants of the cigar and turned to his colleague. "Let's head back. This time, when we meet the people from the Rakeza group, we'll kill them all." His face was blank, but his eyes were cold. Bruno's fellow fighter was spurred by his boss's fervor as they turned back to the front line. Bruno had done a lot of killing to that point. The Rakeza mercenaries weren't weak, but he seemed to have an extraordinary way of cutting people down. The Rakeza mercenaries were on a high when they arrived back at their camp. Blood was still pumping hotly through their veins after what they felt was a very successful day. On arrival, they were greeted by the sound of a fighter aircraft. Everyone was shocked, but they were ready within minutes to defend their position. After only a few hours of a truce, the battle had started again, and it became a daydream. At the same time, Reggie was fighting for his own life. He was covered in blood, but it was almost all the blood of his enemies. He held a pistol in his hand, and his eyes were locked on 3 guns that were aimed at him. One of the men sneered. "We underestimated you. We didn't expect you to escape, or kill 2 of our men. But you only have 2 bullets left in your gun, and we're 4 people." Focusing his eyes in the darkness, Reggie discovered that there was a 4th man in a cloak who had almost become one with the surroundings. "We blew up your father's plane, and it's hard to tell whether he's dead or alive. Regardless, there's no one who can save you now." The man smirked. "Be good. Put the gun down. We won't kill you, because you're still useful." Reggie's eyes were filled with determination, and he was intent on pulling the trigger. His desire to continue the fight was noted, so his opponents crooked their fingers over their triggers at the same time. At that moment, light suddenly rained down from the sky, and everything was illuminated. While things were lit up, they could all see that someone was falling from above. The fallen fighter pilot crawled out from where he had landed. He was covered in blood. The cloaked man, who was standing right beside Gavin, immediately knew who it was. "It's the reinforcements from Chile." Gavin snarled. "Kill them." "Yes, sir." As he lifted his weapon again, a military off-road vehicle suddenly rushed toward them. Rebecca was driving. She locked her eyes on Gavin and stepped on the accelerator with all her might. Rebecca aimed straight for Gavin and accelerated at full speed. One of his men pulled him aside just as she roared past. A gunshot rang out, and Reggie was standing with his gun aimed at the man who had just tried to kill the injured fighter pilot. The bullet grazed the man's arm, and he jumped up, clutching the fighter pilot by his collar. Another one of Gavin's men rushed over to Reggie and pointed the muzzle of his gun against his head. Reggie had used his last 2 bullets and dropped his weapon. Everything had happened so quickly. Gavin's men had lightning-fast reactions and were evidently well-trained to handle conflict situations. Rebecca slammed on her brakes and hit into one of the men. At the same time, she leaned out of the window and aimed at Gavin. The SUV jerked, and her shot missed Gavin, but hit one of his men in the calf. In the glowing of the burning wreckage, Rebecca locked eyes with Gavin. Gavin stared at her as if in a trance. The look in Rebecca's eyes was unmistakable. She instantly reminded him of Nancy. He had only fallen in love once in his life. Nancy was the most beautiful woman he had ever laid eyes on, but he would never confess his love for her because, by some bizarre twist of fate, she had turned out to be his cousin. The young woman who had just tried to kill him glared at him with eyes that looked just like Nancy's. But she also had the hard-set jawline of her father, Jonathan. It was easy for Gavin to guess who she was. It all made sense to him now. She knew he had kidnapped Callum and was responsible for changing her brother into a fighting machine. It was no wonder she wanted to ram into him. Gavin's cold heart beat against his chest, and he breathed deeply to calm himself down. He glanced at his men and saw that they had secured 2 hostages, so he gestured to Rebecca. Rebecca was angry at herself for missing her opportunity to wipe Gavin off the face of the earth. She frowned and got out of her car. She wouldn't have missed him if she had had more combat experience. She held her gun in her right hand and leaned close against the side of the car, ready to get in and leave if she had to. Her eyes darted as she surveyed the situation. She drew in a breath when she saw Reggie, but she didn't let on that she was shocked to find him there. Gavin took a step forward and smiled maliciously. "How nice to see you, my young niece." Rebecca sneered. "This isn't the time for pleasantries. Besides, we're barely related." Gavin scoffed. He had expected her to be rude. "It's such a lovely surprise to run into you out here. What a great way to spend time together." He looked at Reggie and the fighter pilot, and his lips curled into a sinister smile. "Oh, look here. Isn't this cozy? I have two of your friends, and all you have is a gun and a car. If you're lucky, you might be able to save one of them." He chuckled a deep, throaty laugh and sighed dramatically. "Let me make it easier for you. Why don't we choose who to save? I'll be a nice uncle and leave the choice up to you." Rebecca narrowed her eyes and pointed her gun at Gavin. She casually dangled her left hand by her side, and her fingertips touched a small bottle in her pocket. Gavin sneered. "It must be a tough choice for such a lovely young girl to make. Reggie's your childhood friend and the son of your father's enemy. The pilot is your teammate and an experienced combat soldier. I wonder who you'll choose." He glared at her and laughed again. "You have 5 seconds to answer." Gavin glanced at his gun and decided to polish it against his cloak. His eyes shone with excitement. "I'm sure you realize that whoever you don't choose will die." He looked at the man holding a gun against Reggie's temple. Reggie stood dead still as the cold muzzle of the gun pressed against his skin. He looked at Rebecca blankly, as if he didn't care who she would choose. She glanced at the injured fighter pilot. His name was Julian, and although they hadn't spoken much, he had always been kind and respectful toward her. He had often kept an eye out for her whenever Kyle wasn't around, especially in the canteen, where he would hold a place in the queue for her. Julian's fatigues were drenched in blood. She could see that he needed urgent medical attention. She also knew Gavin didn't care about the pilot. Reggie was the real bargaining chip he needed. He had been plotting against the two families for years. He had slyly used Reggie as a catalyst to start a war between the Davis and the Williams families. But his plan had failed when Jonathan and Oliver had joined forces to find Callum. Capturing Reggie was precisely what he needed to blackmail Oliver. Rebecca made her decision without much further thought. "Hand over the pilot." Gavin's eyes lit up, and he looked at Reggie. "What a pity for you. I'm so sorry your friend has chosen the pilot over you. It's not that I don't like you, but it seems she doesn't care much for you. You must be so disappointed." He spoke slowly and with a drawl. Reggie didn't say anything. Instead, he glanced at Rebecca with a glimmer of sadness. Rebecca kept her eyes on Gavin. "Whatever. Are you going to give me the pilot or not?" "Yeah, sure." Gavin gestured toward the man holding Julian. Without taking her eyes off Gavin, Rebecca leaned over and opened the rear passenger door, still pointing the gun at him. She raised her eyebrows. "Hurry up." She then climbed behind the steering wheel and started the engine. Gavin chuckled. "Good girl. Why don't you put your gun away?" She swung the gun to face away from Gavin and waited for Julian to limp toward the car. Gavin's man was still pointing a gun at him as he pulled himself into the car, groaning with pain. The man slammed the door shut. Rebecca quickly glanced at Julian in the rearview mirror. "Buckle up. It's going to be a bumpy ride." She lifted her gun and released the magazine. She unclasped the catch and let the bullets fall out, one by one, just as Kyle had taught her. Back then, her tiny fingers hadn't been strong enough, but Kyle had insisted on making her practice repeatedly until she could do it blindfolded and within record time. She flung the gun onto the passenger seat behind her, turning the steering wheel, and pushed down on the accelerator. As Gavin watched her, recollections from a distant past flashed through his mind. He couldn't help but be reminded of Nancy. He then thought about his sister, how Oliver had ruthlessly murdered her, and Jonathan's involvement in tidying up the crime scene so that no one would ever find out. He suppressed the bitterness welling up in his heart and grunted, "Take Reggie away." Reggie looked at Rebecca's SUV with a heavy heart as she drove off. He shook his head and glanced about, trying to find another way to escape. He didn't believe what Gavin had said about his father. It made no sense for Gavin to hold him hostage if Oliver was already dead. Suddenly, two bright beams of light from the SUV's headlights shined in everyone's eyes. The sound of car tires screeching on the dirt cut through the air. Gavin shielded his eyes from the bright car headlights and saw a small glass bottle explode at his feet, and then a pungent smell filled the air. A sharp, acid smell burned in everyone's airways. Gavin tightened his grip around the gun as he reacted. "We have to leave! Hurry!" He knew about the various reagents developed by the biomanufacturing facility and had admired the technology. But he also knew that whatever Rebecca had thrown at them differed from what he had seen. It was more potent, and most likely deadly too. His throat began to close up, and his eyes burned. He started to gasp for air as he began to suffocate. Rebecca's lips curled into a thin, satisfied smile. She had used the same reagent that Jeremy had used on Kyle, but the concentration in her bottle was much higher. She covered her face with a scarf, leaving her eyes exposed. The SUV drifted across the road toward Reggie and Gavin. Rebecca opened her door, leaned over, and reached out to Reggie. Reggie quickly pushed the gun pressed against his forehead away, not caring whether Gavin would shoot him. He grabbed Rebecca's hand and held on as tightly as he could. Using the momentum of the speeding car, Rebecca pulled Reggie into her SUV. Perhaps it was because of the adrenaline coursing through her veins, but her strength was unbelievable. And a split second later, Reggie was sitting behind the steering wheel. Rebecca fell back against the passenger seat. She exhaled. "You drive." Reggie grabbed the steering wheel, closed the door, and hit the gas pedal. The SUV lurched forward, just in time to dodge a bullet that pierced through the car door, narrowly missing his leg. Rebecca swiftly slithered into the rear of the SUV. She quickly reloaded the magazine and slid it back into her gun. "Let's kill him." Suddenly, a group of armed men rushed out of the darkness and opened fire. They had automatic rifles. Rebecca scowled, knowing that they couldn't do much. "Turn around!" Reggie pulled up the handbrake, turning the steering wheel, and put his foot on the accelerator again. The spinning tires shot dirt and gravel into the air, blinding the gun-wielding men. Reggie pushed the SUV to its maximum speed on the bumpy gravel road. As the sound of the gunshots died down, Reggie began to feel the effect of the reagent. He took large gasps of air and felt his vision begin to blur. Rebecca leaned over from the rear passenger seat and opened her palm to reveal 3 red pills. She spoke fast. "Quick, swallow these. It's the antidote." Reggie opened his mouth and leaned forward to lap the pills up. Shocked, Rebecca pushed her hand against his mouth and felt his soft, warm lips close over the pills. The bitter pills rolled down his throat, and he tried not to gag. The feeling of his lips against her hand seemed to linger. "I've plotted the location of the nearest base on the GPS. Just select the first coordinate on the list and follow the directions. I have to help Julian." Reggie nodded. "Okay." He wanted to ask her why she had risked her life to save him, but he couldn't find the words. Rebecca squatted in between the footwell of the rear passenger seat and the front passenger seats, making Julian lie stretched out across the back seats. She opened her medical bag and began to attend to his gaping wound. She had been traveling back and forth between the front line and the base for the past few days, while Kyle had stayed at the front line. Seeing the wreckages of downed aircraft made her heart sink. The deafening roar of jets racing across the sky and the loud booms of explosions filled the night sky. Rebecca blocked out the noise and focused on Julian. His injuries were severe, and he had lost a lot of blood. He tried his best to remain awake, but his eyes rolled back and he lost consciousness. Rebecca worked fast to stop the bleeding and stitch the wound closed. She then sprinkled Dr. Shenanigan's medicine over the wound before wrapping a bandage around it. She checked Julian's pulse, then her eyes widened. He was dangerously close to slipping into a coma, and urgently needed a blood transfusion. The gravel road was bumpy, and Rebecca glanced out the window. She realized they were driving across the battlefield. Reggie noticed her looking around. "The road you plotted on the GPS was destroyed, and I had a detour. We're approaching the airfield." She nodded and looked up at the sky. She saw a jet high above the clouds and instinctively knew it was Kyle. The way he handled his aircraft was familiar to her. He seemed to dominate the sky. She felt a lump in her throat as she thought about him. He was always gentle and kind with her, yet domineering and ruthless when in battle. It was as if he was a different person when he was in the air. He was wild and arrogant, like a maverick, unconcerned whether he lived or died. She stared at the sky in a daze. Reggie also saw the jet streaking across the sky. "Is it him?" "Yeah." Suddenly, a plane skimmed over them and made a bumpy landing on the makeshift airfield. It was clear from the uncontrolled landing that the pilot was injured. Reggie raced toward the plane, flashing his lights to alert the pilot that help was coming. The pilot had already opened the hatch to the cockpit when they reached the plane. He slid down the side of the aircraft and landed on his knees in the dirt. He coughed violently, and blood seeped out of the corner of his mouth. Rebecca gasped when she saw him. It was Calvin, one of Kyle's squad members. She sized him up and instantly saw that he was suffering from internal bleeding. He gasped for air and winced as he walked bent double toward their vehicle. Rebecca turned to Reggie. "You have to help me with something." He nodded. "What is it?" "There's a medical tent at the far end of the airfield. You need to take him and Julian right away. Neither of them has much time. I have other things I need to take care of here." Reggie's body stiffened, but he didn't ask any questions. "Okay." Rebecca opened the car door and jumped out. She rushed over to Calvin and helped him to the car. She reached into her medical bag and produced a small bottle of pills. Calvin groaned in pain as she took up 3 white pills and gave them to him. "Take these. It should help you until you can get proper medical attention." Calvin nodded. His eyes were filled with sadness. "We lost Marco." Rebecca glanced in the direction of the wreckages she had seen earlier and realized the reality of war wasn't like a big screen action movie. So many lives had been lost since the start of it. They were lucky if they were to come out of it alive. Calvin swallowed the bitter-tasting pills and propped himself up against the backrest of the front passenger seat. "I have to go back. The enemy sent reinforcements. They're attacking from all sides, and we're struggling to fight them off. We can't afford not to have all our planes in the air." He coughed and spat out a large mouthful of blood. "Kyle needs me. I'm going back out there." Rebecca held his arm down. "No, you're in no state to fly. You have to get to the medical tent urgently. Your lungs are filling with blood. If you don't hurry, you'll die." She closed her medical kit and flung it at his feet. "I'm a pilot too. I know how to fly. I'll go." Calvin gulped at her in shock. She spun around and hurried toward the plane without looking back. She only waved her hand in the air to say goodbye. Calvin gritted his teeth. "I'm sure she's a great pilot, but she doesn't have combat experience." He was about to swing his legs out of the car and chase after her, but Reggie leaned over and closed the door. Calvin sighed and put his arms around his chest as he coughed again. Reggie's expression was solemn as he watched Rebecca walk away. "I promised her I'd take you to the medical tent. Buckle up." Calvin glared at the stranger who dared to tell a fighter pilot what to do. Rebecca scrambled up the side of the fighter plane and slid into the cockpit. She snapped the hatch shut, put on the helmet, and strapped herself in. Reggie watched and felt his heart sink. He was reluctant to leave and suddenly felt overcome with worry. He gripped the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white. "See you soon, Rebecca. Come back safely." He watched her turn the jet's nose toward the moon shining on the horizon. The afterburners glowed red and orange as she engaged full throttle and sped into the night sky. Reggie forced himself to look away and head toward the flashing lights of war in the distance. The G-force pressed against Rebecca's chest, and she took deep breaths as the adrenaline of taking off in the jet plane rushed through her body. Although she had accumulated more than the required number of flight hours to be a fighter pilot, none of them had been in a real-life war situation. It was also vastly different from where she had had Kyle to guide her, like the first time she had flown a fighter jet. The head-up display, perfectly designed to line up with her sight, showed a swarm of aircraft in the air, darting about erratically. The simulators back in the Air Force Academy hadn't prepared her for this. A voice crackled over Rebecca's earphones. HR 0045, confirm your coordinates. She quickly flipped the microphone closer. Roger that, Captain. I'm almost with the rest of the squad. Kyle had received a message from Calvin saying he had landed, so he had been surprised to see the plane appear on his head-up display again. He heard Rebecca's voice and frowned. Return to the team. We're in a trail formation. I'll line up to the left flank of HR 0291. Roger, Captain. Rebecca's body tingled with excitement, but she was also nervous about being in real battle. Esther had once teased Nancy about her triplets. She had said that Tristan had inherited Jonathan's calm, rational, and indifferent personality traits, but lacked his arrogance. On the other hand, Callum had inherited Jonathan's arrogance, but it wasn't as apparent, because he also had the same playfulness as his father. Rebecca was almost like a carbon copy of her father. She was bold, adventurous, and decisive. But she could also be calm and rational when it was most critical. Rebecca caught up with her squadron and fell into formation. She focused on her instruments, realizing that one false move could kill them all. Her lips curled into a smile as she saw Kyle's plane. She remembered when she was still studying at the Air Force Academy, and her roommate had asked her to describe her dream boyfriend. She had said they had to have the same interests as her, and preferably be a fighter pilot. It seemed as if her dream had come true. Kyle's voice sounded in her earphones again. Be prepared. The enemy has changed tactics. He paused briefly. HR 0045, keep your eyes on your head-up display. Don't get distracted by looking around. The other pilots burst out laughing. They had heard Rebecca's voice, but weren't sure it was her. Kyle's comment was the confirmation they needed. Soaring above the world in a battle of life and death, the young fighter pilots didn't seem to care about the danger they were in. Instead, they began to tease Rebecca and Kyle. HR 0045, the captain is warning you. HR 0045, if we were on the ground, our captain would be holding your hand right now. HR 0045, is this your first date in the sky? The pilots laughed and joked, but fell silent when the enemy's planes appeared on their screens. Kyle's pupils constricted as he focused. Scatter launch! He paused for a second before he gave his squad a warning. Make fun of me and Rebecca again, and we'll see who's left laughing when we're on the ground again. The others laughed, but stopped joking around when Kyle alerted them to enemy aircraft approaching. They looked at the screens on their dashboards and roared ahead. Let's kill those bastards. Rebecca found herself cursing along with the other pilots. Kyle frowned as he accelerated. His fighter jet flew across the sky at full speed. His radar locked onto one of the enemy planes, and he fired a missile. Rebecca looked out the window to see if Kyle had successfully destroyed the aircraft. Suddenly, her screen started flashing red, and the alarm sounded, indicating that she was also a target. Rebecca panicked, but then forced herself to calm down and think of the technique she had learned to dodge missiles. She quickly turned her plane's nose upward and took off, escaping just in time. She then activated the tracking system and destroyed the missiles. She looked at her screen and was relieved to see that she was out of harm's way. She broke into a cold sweat, thinking how different it was to be facing the enemy in a real-life situation. Despite all the drills and practices during training, nothing had prepared her for something like that. She realized that even the slightest distraction or mistake could cost her life. Rebecca took a deep breath to calm herself. She finally felt like she had become one with the plane, and it was exhilarating. She had known ever since she was a child that becoming a fighter pilot was her destiny. Her skills were improving, and after the initial anxiety and fear, she gradually got used to flying the fighter jet. She forced herself to concentrate on the task at hand. More enemy planes had arrived, and the battle in the air was intensifying. She didn't dare think about what that meant. She listened to Kyle's instructions and did as she was told. The fighting on the ground had also increased. The artillery on either side of the border was firing away incessantly, and it was impossible to determine who had the upper hand. Just then, Rebecca's screen lit up again, and she heard one of the pilots scream over the radio. "They got me! Red alert! I'm about to go down!" His voice got cut off then. It was followed by Kyle's announcement that the Red Eagles had just arrived. Rebecca's heart was pounding in her chest. She knew the Red Eagles were an invincible elite Air Force fighter squadron. Their captain, Blaze, was a world-famous ace pilot who had never been defeated. Kyle was equally shocked that the Red Eagles had joined the war effort, and he suddenly realized that the reagent formula the Chilean biomanufacturing facility had developed was more valuable than he had thought. His skills were about to be put to the test. The downing of his pilot's aircraft had left a gaping hole on his left side, and the enemy was fast approaching. He quickly ordered the other pilots to fill the gap and lock on to their rival's aircraft. Rebecca was closest to the empty spot in their formation. "Roger that. I'm getting in position." When Kyle heard her say that, he became frightened. It was the most dangerous position to be in. There was nothing Kyle could do. Rebecca had already confirmed her position. He tried to convince himself that they were at war and that she was no different from any of the other fighter pilots in their squadron. But he wasn't at all sure that she was experienced enough to go head-to-head with the terrifying, invincible Blaze. He fervently hoped she knew what she was doing. One small mistake, and the ace fighter pilot would take her out. The best he could do was guide her so that nothing terrible happened. "I'll cover you." "Roger that." They flew through the sky. She could barely see Kyle's aircraft since there were so many others flying around her. She knew he was using his high-tech anti-tracking tool to avoid their enemy's radar. Rebecca and a few of the other fighter jets on the left flew into the enemy's airspace to attract their firepower. She was more than nervous that time. A lot was at stake, and she could feel the adrenaline pumping through her body. She kept her eyes glued to the dashboard as she used her best judgment to make one quick decision after the other. The battle in the air was intense, and she had to clear her mind and stay focused. She didn't dare think about the consequences if she failed her mission. All she knew was that she had to attract the enemy but avoid their missiles as the other pilots in her squadron destroyed their opponents. She hoped Kyle would blow the Red Eagles to smithereens. Just then, she saw a missile explode in the air, barely missing her plane. She could feel the aircraft shake, and it spun around a few times before she managed to pull it back and return to her original position. Kyle could see her from his jet. He was incredibly afraid for her, yet he knew he couldn't help her. It was every pilot for themselves. He wondered why they hadn't received intelligence about Peru's infamous Red Eagle squadron joining the battle until it was too late. He knew his team couldn't retreat, otherwise they would be dead before they turned their planes around. He had to fight until they destroyed every last enemy aircraft. Kyle was more determined than ever to defeat their rivals. He had the passion and fearlessness of a young man in his 20s, and he flew full speed ahead. 2 red dots on his screen disappeared. He was furious since he knew it meant 2 of their fighter jets had been destroyed. Meanwhile, Rebecca had broken into a cold sweat. All her muscles were tense, and she could hear herself breathing heavily. Her hands gripped the wheel as she continued looking at the screen in front of her. They were steadily advancing. Kyle suddenly overtook Rebecca's jet and flew straight into the enemy's airspace, heading toward Blaze's aircraft. She checked the distance on her screen and gasped. The other pilot shouted words of encouragement at him through the radio. "Go get him, Captain!" "Damn it! I almost managed to destroy one of their planes. Hope you get better luck, Kyle." "Kill those pieces of shit, Captain." They also joked around to alleviate the tension they all felt. "I'm gonna find myself a girlfriend as soon as we get back." "Ha! I always knew you were a virgin." Suddenly, there was silence. Rebecca stared at her screen in horror. 2 of the red dots had disappeared. She burst into tears. Rebecca knew that the 2 pilots she had heard talking on the radio just moments ago had been hit. It wasn't the first time she had witnessed such an event, but it shook her to her core. Kyle had just entered enemy airspace, and he gripped the wheel with determination. He was hell-bent on killing the pilots who had targeted 2 of his own. After locking onto one of his opponent's aircraft, he fired a missile. However, at that very moment, his anti-tracking instrument failed, and the Red Eagles locked onto his fighter jet. Suddenly, he became their #1 target. Rebecca started trembling as she and the other pilots accelerated and headed toward the enemy. Blaze, the Red Eagle's ace pilot, expertly dodged Kyle's close-range missiles, maneuvering his aircraft with incredible ease. However, Kyle was relentless, and he succeeded in clipping one of the wings with a missile. The wing instantly caught on fire, and Blaze lost control of his jet. The plane started spinning down toward the ground. Rebecca had just locked onto another fighter jet when she noticed Blaze's plane falling from the sky right above her. She panicked, knowing that if she left her position, she'd be targeted by enemy missiles. But if she didn't move her aircraft out of the way, Blaze's plane would crash into hers. Kyle was surrounded by the enemy, so he couldn't possibly help her. She decided to stay in position and pray that she wouldn't be hit. Her life suddenly flashed before her eyes. Everything was happening so fast. She could see the charred remains of the other aircraft approaching. Blaze was nowhere to be seen in the cockpit, so she assumed he had ejected as soon as he had lost control of his plane. She felt utterly helpless. If Blaze was still in the plane when it crashed, Kyle's efforts wouldn't have been in vain. At that moment, it seemed to her that she would be the only victim. Rebecca wished she knew what to do. She realized she was still too inexperienced to be in such a dangerous situation. She looked out the window and saw Blaze's jet spinning faster and faster, falling from the sky at an unfathomable speed. She had only a few seconds left before the inevitable crash, and no amount of training she had could save her. She stared at the red dot on the dashboard screen, indicating the approaching aircraft. She could already feel the invisible hand of death reaching out to take her into the eternal abyss. Kyle was still in the center of the vortex, desperately shooting missiles at the Red Eagles while he dodged theirs. After hitting one, he turned around to check on his team. His breath caught in his throat when he saw Blaze's flaming fighter jet crash into Rebecca's aircraft. He shouted her call sign into the radio, demanding that she reply, but there was no answer. He tried again. When he still couldn't get a reply, he called out her name. "Becky, what's going on? Answer me, damn it!" There was dead silence. He continued to scream into the radio until his voice became hoarse.